It is almost that time, y'all. We're a couple months away from MLB The Show 23 being released and available. And I want to take a few minutes and just talk about some franchise mode features that I feel have been lacking. Would love to see either reintroduced, introduced for the first time, improved, or even removed from the game necessarily. That I think could take franchise mode to the next level. I know a lot of the focus from the development team over the last several years has been more on the online experience. I don't think there's any secret about that. Franchise mode players, they're a loyal base, but we have been hungry for some updates and a complete makeover to the franchise mode experience. We haven't seen one in a while. I think we're due for some upgrades and some changes, but here's a short list of some of the ones that I think could have the biggest impact on the gameplay experience in franchise mode. First and foremost, and probably the one that has the most overall impact on the gameplay experience, would be to make budgets matter again. Um, Bring back things like having to focus on your marketing expenses so that the more you invest, the more likely fans are to actually show up at the games. They're going to spend money on concessions and merchandise based on what you actually offer, the prices that you offer it at, etc. And then also have things like your medical staff, your training staff that you have to invest in, and finally travel and lodging. There was a version of MLB The Show, I want to say it was back around like 2012, where you had to pick your mode of transportation. It started you with like a team bus, which is not realistic, but the general concept was if your guys are showing up on a team bus, they're going to be uncomfortable, tired, morale is going to be low, whereas if they're coming in on a chartered jet, they're going to be fresh and ready to go and morale is going to be much higher. Introduce aspects like that back into the game, and it can create so much better of a franchise mode experience and really give you much more granular control over the actual long term and even short term success of a franchise. Now, one thing that budget would actually also kind of help introduce is realistic options for relocation of a team. Like, for example, if I'm the Oakland A's, I might be able to get away with saving up my money for a couple of years and then start looking to relocate. We're probably not going to rebuild a new stadium, especially if the city is not going to help chip in. But let's say I wanted to move to Montreal and they're hungry for a team. I can submit to the MLB a request to relocate the team. If it gets approved, maybe we've got to realign divisions a little bit, but it's going to take a couple years to build that stadium. So meanwhile, my team is going to be, low morale. My fans are going to abandon me, and it's going to be really hard for me financially over that next year or so, especially if that team is not playing well. Maybe you get lucky, and in the process of that final year before you relocate, the team actually has one last hurrah, and the fans show up to kind of support their team as a going away party. But nonetheless, the idea of the budget kind of impacting the ability to relocate, I think could add a nice element to the game, especially now that we've got the ability to do the stadium creator that they introduced with some of the online modes. Along the lines of relocation is the idea of expansion. Now, this is something that they'd have to be really careful about how they introduce, or even if they introduce it, because you're only going to be able to do expansion like one time in a franchise playthrough. Essentially because you can only add so many teams before it just gets a little bit too crowded in the division races, etc. And it's like, where do you put teams? There's only so many cities that could support a major league squad. But the bottom line is, if you do it, it has to be done with like that authentic feel where you get it right and it's done the way an actual expansion draft would be done, like they did it in 97. And I think it's like the first round, each team protects 15 of its players, and then the two expansion teams each draft 14 players, and it can only be like one per team kind of thing. And then they do a second round like that, and then they do a third round where each team drafts 7 players, and that gives them a 35-man roster essentially, and the rest is up to them in terms of minor league affiliates and using the free agent market to fill your 40-man roster. I think expansion has some potential in the game, but again, they got to be careful about how they do it. Now, we talked about how the online mode has really gotten a lot of focus over the last several years. And one of the things that franchise mode players have really been hungry for is a revamped scouting mechanism. So it hasn't really changed that much in the last several years. And I feel like, at least for me, the way I do it, it is very hands-on to scout players exactly the way that I want to, and eventually end up getting the guys that I feel like are going to help me build a dominant squad. I want it to be a little bit less hands-on from a day-to-day management perspective, but then when it comes time for the draft, I want the content that they provide to me through the overall scouting process to be more in-depth. Like, for example, I want to know a little bit about the guy's, like, makeup, for example. I want to know if he's considering going to play football instead of baseball, or if he's a guy that's in high school and we're drafting second overall because we were terrible the year before. Maybe he doesn't want to play for us, and if we draft him, he goes to college instead of coming to the major leagues, and now I've got to recycle that pick next year, and in the meantime, that's one major spot that I don't have a guy developing within my franchise because he chose to go to college instead of come play for a crappy team. So again, I think the overall consensus here is that the scouting mechanism needs an update. I don't know exactly how you do it, but those are my suggestions as to what they could do to make it easier to manage throughout the season and then more in depth during the draft itself. One thing about the current franchise mode that has always kind of bugged me is the clutch attribute. I don't think clutch means what we think it means in terms of how the mechanics of the game actually work. What I think clutch does in the game is actually just make a guy more consistent. It doesn't necessarily mean that in a high pressure situation he's more likely to succeed because he's clutch. It's just he's more likely to succeed because he's consistent. I want to see a consistency factor or a clutch factor, or both. But bottom line, make it to where guys with low clutch just fold under the pressure. Guys with high clutch just find a way to get it done. Guys that are consistent are going to be less streaky. So they're going to have fewer and fewer scenarios where they go into a cold streak or necessarily into a hot streak. They're just going to be steady Eddie all year long. So the more consistent they are, the less they're going to stray from their typical season-wide, expectations in terms of, batting average, OPS, etc. Hope that makes sense, but again, that's just one little attribute change that I think they can introduce that would make the game a little bit more interesting. While we're on the topic of the attributes and the roster in general, one thing that I wish that they would change is having a distinguish between closing pitcher and relief pitcher. Just make it relief pitcher / closer, and that way when a AI is looking at who they want to put where, whether it's me in a auto managed type scenario or the CPU kind of deciding who's going to go where in their bullpen. It doesn't necessarily look and say, okay, this is my best closer, he's my closer, and then these are my best relief pitchers, that's going to be my relief staff. It's going to look at who's the best arm and put him in the right spots accordingly. It doesn't matter if the guy has a CP at the end of his name and there's a better closing pitcher ahead of him. He's still going to be in my bullpen. I'm just going to make him a setup guy, for example. And I think the game does not do a very good job of that right now. Easy fix, just get rid of the closing pitcher versus relief pitcher differentiator and just make them all either a starter or a reliever. Problem solved. All right, we've got 3 more ideas, and these are all going to go into the gameplay experience, not so much the franchise management aspect, but actual in-game presentation experience. The first one, bring back the idea of being able to argue with an umpire. I don't remember if it was MLB the Show or 2K back in the day that had the ability to go argue a call, and depending on like the result of that confrontation, your team would either get a boost or they would kind of take it the wrong way, and now all of a sudden morale is a little bit lower, making a comeback hypothetically that much harder. That's an element that I wish they would bring back. You got to make it to where maybe the ability to argue depends on the actual number or influence of bad calls throughout the course of the game. So you can't just arbitrarily decide to argue. But throughout the game, it kind of keeps track when an umpire misses a call off the edge or gives the other pitcher a call when it was out of the zone, that sort of thing, or a safe out that maybe didn't get reviewed or whatever. Bottom line, make it to where we can argue calls again, and I think you add a feature that a lot of guys and a lot of players would enjoy. Next up on the list of ideas to introduce to the game is Rainouts. So I don't understand why this has been so difficult to try and figure out over the last 20 years, but why can't we introduce Rainouts to the Major League experience? So bottom line, you could have it where if the game gets, if you click play game and or even simulate game, there's a pop-up says tonight's game was rained out. Now we either have to make it up the next day. If we're still in town, we do a doubleheader. Or if we're supposed to have a day off, you just play that day kind of thing, and then it's the get out of town day for the visiting team. Or if, let's say I'm playing in New York, I'm supposed to play in Boston the next day, and tonight's game gets rained out, we have to find a point in time later in the season to try and make that game up. So it would be a really easy mechanic to introduce. I feel like whenever the game is, whenever you select to either play or simulate a game, it just takes a 1 in 60 chance, for example, and says if it hits, it's a rain out. If it's not, you play the game. You could even have games that start and then get suspended due to rain, and you don't resume. But bottom line, I don't know why it's that difficult to introduce that mechanic, and it's something that I think could add to the experience, especially if you go back to my idea about budgets and you've got travel and lodging, for example, or even your medical staff or training staff that can influence your team's, endurance, durability, etc. Now, rainouts become that more relevant if you've got a team that's, running on a budget and everybody is already grumpy, tired, uncomfortable when they travel, and now they got to play a doubleheader. That's not going to go so well for a team like that. But for the one that coddles its players, and they fly with chartered buses, and they stay at the Westin everywhere they go, it's a little bit different when they have to stay for a doubleheader because they're still in sort of a cush environment for that day that they've got to stay over, and they play a doubleheader the next day. Everything is hunky-dory. Last but not least is the idea of interactions with the media. So you could do post-game interviews with the manager where it's like an actual press conference type environment, or you could do the on-field post-game interview if it's player of the game and your team is hot. You have certain parameters that kick off these little mini cutscene type idea, but the bottom line is if you do it occasionally, don't overdo it and make the optional responses not be super redundant. I feel like that could add a nice little element to the game because you could have a scenario where the team has lost 5 in a row. They do a post-game press conference with the manager and they ask him like what do you accredit to the recent struggles, and if he can say either take the blame myself or put it on the players, that's going to create 2 huge different responses as far as how the team responds, and it could have positive impacts for ownership or negative impacts for the players or vice versa. But bottom line, I think those kind of post-game media interactions could really take the game up to the next level and just again elevate that in-game experience for the franchise mode that we've all been hungry to see. I know this was a lot in a short window, but hopefully that gives you some ideas of potential features to be asking these developers to throw into franchise mode in the future. Eventually, they're going to have to invest some time and effort into franchise mode, and when they do, we want them to be chock full of recommendations and ideas from the franchise community. So be sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, comment below, and we appreciate you watching.
Good evening, friends and neighbors. Or shall I say this afternoon?